Hello again. So today I want to talk a little bit about consent theory, or what most people call social contract theory. Now, consent theory is the theory of political authority that says that you acquire political obligations to a state because you agreed to them, frequently as a part of an exchange of obligations, and that's the exchange of obligations is what's modeled or called social contract theory. This means that in addition to you having obligations, the state also acquires a right to issue laws and commands for you. Why? Well, simply because you agreed to it. So in other words, we have a theory of political authority that's wrapped up in a theory of political obligation. How does consent theory work? Well, I think the idea is pretty simple and intuitive. If you authorize the government to make laws for you, you are delegating some of your rights and liberties to it. This works in roughly the same way as when you authorize your car mechanic to repair your car, your stockbroker to manage your 401k, or a babysitter to supervise your children. There's going to be a transfer of power and authority from you to an agent, usually for specific purposes and for a determinate amount of time. We understand this delegation of power, this consent to alienate some of our rights to another agent fairly intuitively. We do it all the time. We can ask ourselves, though, why does this work, right? Why does consent or promising create moral duties at all? Well, a couple of reasons, perhaps. One, keeping promises, keeping your word makes cooperation, social cooperation possible. If you couldn't rely on people who gave you their word, it would be very hard to trust them. And so without people keeping their promises, nobody would trust one another, and we wouldn't be able to engage in even the most minimal forms of social cooperation. Why is securing consent from others important? So we understand that consent creates moral duties, but why don't we just go ahead and make people do what's necessary? Make people do what's right, or make people do what would benefit long-term aggregate happiness, for example. Well, on the one hand, securing people's consent is a mark of respect, a mark of honor. It's a way of showing that people have a right to pursue their own ends in life, that they have their own goals, their own life to live that's separate from yours, and that their values and priorities might not be the same as yours. And so by securing your consent when you propose, by securing their consent when you propose to do something to them, you are showing a respect for them as persons, rather than as being mere means or mere tools to pursue your ends. Another way of looking at consent, though, and at the importance of consent is that consent lowers the costs of social transaction. That is to say, coercing people is costly. Forcing people to do stuff is expensive. And consent, and acquiring their consent, is a simple rule, one that everybody can understand relatively intuitively, and it's one that helps ease transactions. It helps people do things because they want to, not because they're being coerced to do so. Let's look at a couple different examples of consent, and in part the point of looking at these hypotheticals is going to be to give an idea of what consent can and cannot authorize. So I want to talk about, first example is the drowning man example, and if any of you have taken this class before or talked to people who've taken my class, I use the drowning man example a lot. And the drowning man example is where one person is saving another from drowning. Let's imagine there's this guy called Jim, and Jim is drowning in a pond. His boat has sunk, and for whatever reason he can't swim to shore. Maybe he's has his arm in a cast or something. And Jack drifts by him in a boat. Jack is fishing, and Jack says, "I will save you, Jim, but you must agree to give to me your life savings when we get back to shore." Jack, in other words, is offering Jim a deal. The deal is Jim gets rescued, and Jack gets all of Jim's life savings. Jim says, "Hey, I'm drowning, and it doesn't cost you anything to save me. Why should I have to pay my life savings?" And Jack replies, "Look, I had nothing to do with your boat sinking. You're lucky I happen to enjoy fishing in this spot. If you don't want to give me your life savings, that's fine. Maybe someone else will come along and give you a better deal. That's cool. Jim ultimately relents and says, okay, just get me out of the water. I agree, I'll give you my life savings. Just get me out of here so I don't drown. Now, the question becomes, when Jim and Jack get to shore, does Jim have a moral duty to empty his bank account and give it to the man who saved his life, as he promised? And that's kind of a difficult question. We'll talk about it later, but I want you to keep it in your mind. Jim did promise Jack, but there might also be reasons why we wouldn't want to hold Jim to his promise. Let me give you a second example. I'm going to call this the economic development example. I want you to imagine that an American company like Walcorp is a big manufacturing company, and it's hiring in India right now. And many of the locals are extremely poor and quite unskilled. Some have menial jobs right now, or are street vendors, and others are even worse off. They sift through garbage dumps to try and survive. Walmart looks at the wages in the area and is going to offer slightly higher wages than most people in the area earn, because they're trying to attract some of the best and brightest talent in the area, but at a cheap cost, much cheaper than they would in the United States. Now, the hours are long and the benefits are few, but thousands apply for a few dozen jobs that Walcorp is offering. Now, local labor leaders protest and try to organize a strike. They say, look, you're exploiting our workers. You're paying them far less than you would in America, and none of the workers really feel like they can say anything to you, because if they do, they're going to get fired and they're going to return to their previous jobs, or even worse, they're going to end up picking garbage through a giant garbage dump. And the Walcorp executives, predictably, as often do in this sort of story, they answer, well, we didn't put your workers in poverty. We're offering them better wages than anyone else in the area. They've consented to their wages and working conditions, and so they've got to abide by their contracts. They can't strike. They shouldn't strike, and they shouldn't, be trying to upset the situation that they ultimately agreed to. So then the question becomes, are the workers of Walcorp obligated to keep their word and not strike, or should they have a right to strike without fear of being fired? And again, I don't know what your intuitions are in here, but on the one hand, we do have the moral force of the consent that the workers gave, and the fact that it's consent not to something that makes them worse off, but something that makes them better off. And there's no suspicion that Walcorp did anything to make that region of India poor. They just came along and saw an opportunity to make themselves better off and to make the people there better off than they would be otherwise. On the other hand, we have to say that the individuals there are in dire circumstances. They are very, very poor. Walcorp, in a way, is taking advantage of their lack of options and their lack of employment opportunities and their desperation. And we might wonder whether we want to hold people to that kind of to all of their agreements when they make the agreements in those circumstances. All right, finally, let me give you a third example. This example is Bob, and Bob works for Walcorp in the United States. America at this time is booming. There are labor shortages, which means that wages are rising, and indeed, maybe even bills are being considered in the legislature to allow more immigration into the country. America has generous welfare benefits, in this particular America, and has unemployment compensation. So nobody is being forced to work. If they don't work, they won't die. Bob decides to work for Walcorp in America and agrees to a 2-year contract. Remember, wages are rising, so fixed-term contracts are very advantageous for employers because they can secure a labor force that's not going to leave when they're on a contract, or at least if they leave, they get compensated for the fact the worker's leaving. And so, but 1 year into the contract, Bob sees another job, but some other company that pays a lot higher, pays higher wages, and he wants to leave without paying the penalties specified for early termination in his contract. So the question becomes, in this case, should Bob honor the terms of his contract? Now, I think in this case, we're much more inclined or much less uncomfortable with holding Bob to the terms of his deal. I mean, yes, we think that American laborers should be free, but in this case, Bob agreed without reservation in a situation where he wasn't coerced. He wasn't in any particular desperate circumstances. The labor market is good, so it's not like he can't find another job. In fact, he has found another job, but he agreed. He agreed to terms of compensation, a 2-year contract. In fact, he probably got higher wages because he agreed to the determinate term contract. So what these 3 examples do, I think, is highlight different ideas or intuitions about how much we should take seriously people's consent and people's word. People who have very thin accounts of consent often think that any sign of consent counts as fully binding. That is to say that if you give your word, you should keep it just about no matter what. Those of you who thought that Jim should empty his bank account when he got to shore probably have a very thin account of consent. Then you have somewhat less thin accounts of consent, where some minimal conditions must apply for consent to be binding. So those of you who thought that Jim did not have a duty to empty his bank account to Jack in the first example, but did think that the Indian workers had an obligation not to strike if they had agreed not to do so, you guys probably have a thin account of consent. And finally, those of you who have a thick account of consent probably rejected the first 2 options. You probably thought that there was no way Jim should pay Jack when he gets to shore, and you probably thought that the Indian workers had a complete right to strike because they were being exploited by the corporation. But you may or may not have thought that Bob should have the right to leave his contract. Again, it looks like Bob's got many options. His consent can only be the product of his desire and his will, and so it's hard to see why you wouldn't hold Bob to his deal. But, again, you can have different thicknesses in terms of your account of consent, but the point is that people who think that very stringent conditions have to apply before consent is binding are people with thick accounts of consent. Okay, so when we look at these 3 situations, in all 3 cases we have people giving their consent to various kinds of arrangements that make them better off than they would have been otherwise. So no one's consenting to something that makes them worse off. It's not like somebody coming along pointing a gun to your head and giving you 2 bad options, or someone making you choose between shooting one child and shooting the other child, right? A Sophie's choice. Now, in this case, your agreement does make you better off, but the thing that's clear is that we don't feel very comfortable holding the drowning man to his bargain, but we generally feel pretty comfortable holding Bob to his. And part of the difference in the situation is going to be that Jim, the drowning man, has no real viable alternatives. He's going to sit there and die, probably, if he doesn't accept Jack's offer. But Bob, on the other hand, had many alternatives, whereas the Indian workers had bad alternatives, but not necessarily life-threatening ones. When Bob gives his word, we're pretty confident that Bob's choice is an expression of his free will, but when Jim gives his word, Jim's consent also seems to be an artifact of his desperate situation. Jim really doesn't have much of a choice, and so we're not sure how much his word should bind him. When we think about consent theory and its role in early modern accounts of political theory, that is to say Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, we see that the theorists have different ideas about how much consent should be binding. Hobbes, in particular, has a very thin account of consent. He understands quite well that people are going to do anything and say anything to get out of the state of nature, right? The state of nature being this awful, awful place. And for Hobbes, because you'll do and say anything, the state or whatever protection agency ultimately gets them out of the state of nature is therefore going to be allowed to dictate its terms, pretty much. Anybody capable of keeping the peace can dictate whatever terms they want, and you are going to ultimately abide by those terms because you have to. So for Hobbes, your consent is going to be absolute and binding, and at the end of the day, anything you get from the state, of course, is better than what you would get in the state of nature. Um, Locke, on the other hand, doesn't really need such a thin account of consent because the state of nature is not so bad. And for that reason, an agreement made in the agreements aren't made in such desperate circumstances. And this is reflected in his views on the social contract, and indeed how he thinks that sometimes the social contract can be dissolved when the government fails to meet its obligations. In other words, sometimes it's okay to break your promises. Which leaves us with the question of how to decide which account of consent we should endorse. Should we have thin account of consent or a thick account of consent? And is there a principled way of deciding what kind of consent we should hold as binding? I want you to think back at what we said about what the point of consent was. If the point of consent is to mark respect for persons or to protect their central interests in life, then I think it becomes more controversial as to whether Jim should empty his bank account, because ultimately it's not in Jim's central interests. It doesn't really protect his interests to empty his bank account, and it's not clear what central interests Jack has in Jim's bank account. I mean, he's got certainly an interest in it, but it doesn't mean that there's nothing that protects his central interests about getting all of Jim's money. Maybe some of it would have been fine, but all of it seems excessive. And so, if you think that the point is to respect people, it's just not clear that Jack making that offer is really a way of respecting Jim as a person. In fact, it seems the opposite. It seems a way of exploiting Jim. On the other hand, if the point of consent is to make transactions easier, to make it easier to make transactions where both sides win, then a thin version of consent seems to make a lot more sense. The point, after all, is to get mutually advantageous transactions going. And of course, the rescue of Jim by Jack is a mutually advantageous transaction. Jim gets his life, and Jack gets a lot of money. Win-win. So what do you think? Is the primary point of holding people to their agreements to make mutually beneficial transactions easier, or is it to show respect for persons? Or perhaps is it to protect people's central interests? And I think ultimately your answer to what kind of consent you think is binding is going to depend on what the central purpose of consent is for you.